In this screencast, we are learning about cellular respiration, and from class today, you probably realize that there are a whole bunch of steps, and it can be quite complex, so let's start to break it down. In this diagram, we can see a bunch of those steps, right? We know that glycolysis is going to be important, and then that is feeding that pyruvate into something called the citric acid cycle, which is sometimes also called the Krebs cycle. And we also need to, in the mitochondria, do something called oxidative phosphorylation and use the electron transport chain. We also can do the anaerobic process, which means we aren't going to be using any oxygen, but we'll go into more detail about that in just a bit. The process of cellular respiration is going to be using enzymes to break down our glucose, C6H12O6, and this is going to be happening in the presence of oxygen so that we can then produce our ATP, right? That's our cellular energy. So there I have written out for you in words. Keep in mind that this process, as we can see with this image here with the cow, is closely related to what the plants are doing in photosynthesis, right? So our animal, like this cow here, it'll break down sugar molecules in its body by taking in the oxygen from the plant, and in that breakdown in cellular respiration, it's going to cause the animal to release carbon dioxide, which then our plant is going to absorb. It's going to use the carbon to make sugars and do the process of photosynthesis. And again, the plant will produce oxygen as a byproduct that the animal can then take in. This whole process is happening in either the cytoplasm or in the mitochondria. So remember, we see glycolysis outside here, and then the rest of the steps are happening inside of the mitochondrion. Keep in mind that this process is occurring in the presence of oxygen, meaning it's aerobic. If oxygen is not present, then anaerobic respiration will occur, and a process like fermentation will happen. So this here is an image showing you that process of fermentation. We won't go into detail about that in this screencast though, so no need to write anything down about that process, except that it's happening in the absence of oxygen. As we talked about in class, there are 3 stages to cellular respiration. Glycolysis is going to need to happen first. Again, that is going to happen outside of the mitochondria in the cytoplasm. Then we move on to do the Krebs cycle, which is sometimes also referred to as the citric acid cycle. That's happening inside of the mitochondrion. And lastly, we'll need to use the electron transport chain and chemiosmosis to finish up this process. Again, this image is showing us where they're happening, right? So glycolysis outside of the mitochondrion, then our citric acid cycle or Krebs cycle in it, and then also the electron transport chain and chemiosmosis happening inside it. We do something called oxidative phosphorylation. Don't worry about that term yet. So first step is going to be glycolysis. You can think of breaking apart that word glycolysis into glyco and lysis, which means that we're going to split a 6-carbon glucose into 2 pyruvates, and each of those will have 3 carbons. Keep in mind that this process can occur without oxygen. It does not require oxygen. I'm going to draw out how glycolysis works, and then I'll add a little image next to it that may look a little neater than the one that I've drawn. We know that glycolysis starts with a glucose molecule, and glucose has 6 carbons, so let's draw those as circles. Then we're going to add something into that glucose, and it's going to be ATP. The ATPs, as we know, tend to donate phosphates, so let's add those to the end of the 6 carbons. And if we've taken the phosphates off, we're then just left with ADPs. Then from there, that molecule, again, I don't care that you know what it's called, but that then will need to split into 2. So it really is just being split right down the middle there. This portion coming off here, and this portion going there. We're then going to add a phosphate onto the other end of each of those 3-carbon pyruvate molecules. Excuse me, that is not pyruvate. Pyruvate will be at the end here, I'm sorry. The first thing that we'll add in is NAD+ to both sides, which we see there and there. From that we'll get out our NADH and NH+. we'll also add in those 2 ADPs, and from that make ATP, and from that, promise we're done here with glycolysis, we have made pyruvate. So don't worry about all of these little steps here, but keep in mind our net sort of usage, right? So in general, we have formed 4 ATP, right? We have 2 here on the left and 2 here on the right. But we also are using 2 ATP up in this upper portion, right? So our net amount of ATP is going to be 2. We also started out with a glucose molecule, and that's turned into the 2-pyruvate, and it also creates water. Lastly, we're going to create a bunch of other things that are kind of small. We put in 2 NAD pluses. You can see one there, second one there. We're also going to have to put electrons in, 4 of those, and also 4 hydrogens. And from that, we're able to create 2 NADHs and 2 H pluses. So we're having a net yield of 2 ATP and also a net yield of 2 NADHs per glucose molecule. Also remember that the NADH that we've created and also H pluses, those are going to be energy carriers. But once we've created our 2 pyruvates, that's going to finish up glycolysis. So here's a nice pretty diagram drawing exactly what I drew on the other slide for you, showing you that in this upper portion we need to invest energy, right? That's in the form of ATP. And then in the second portion down below, we're going to be able to create ATP. So that's our energy payoff. And again, it shows you the net formation that we have. So to summarize, in glycolysis, we are taking the 6-carbon glucose molecule, and then we're going to split it into 3 carbon molecules called pyruvate, and you're going to make 2 of them. This part of cellular respiration, glycolysis, is actually anaerobic. So it's going to happen whether or not oxygen is present. Oxygen is not required. And then the last point I want to make is that we have a net yield of 2 ATP per glucose molecule. So yes, we're able to create 4 ATP, 2 of which here on the left, 2 from the other pyruvate on the right, making a total of 4, but we also are investing 2 in this upper step in the energy investment portion, and so because of that, the net yield of ATP will only be 2. From there, the pyruvate that we've created, shown there and there, those 3 carbon molecules, it will then move into the inner compartment of the mitochondrion, and it will then go through a little reaction that will prepare it for the next stage of respiration, right, which is our Krebs cycle, or the citric acid cycle, which will take our pyruvate and it's going to turn it into something called acetyl-CoA, which can then enter into the Krebs cycle, or that citric acid cycle. If oxygen is not present, then that pyruvate will be converted into lactic acid, and this again can't happen in the mitochondrion, it's going to happen in the cytoplasm. So I'm going to stop our screencast here, but remember, keep in mind this here, talking about glycolysis. Glycolysis will always happen before we move on to do either aerobic or anaerobic respiration. It's always going to be that first step. So even though it happens in the cytoplasm and doesn't require oxygen, we need this process to happen before we can get to doing aerobic respiration. After glycolysis, if we're doing aerobic respiration, we'll move on to the citric acid, or the Krebs cycle, then use the electron transport chain, electron transport system, it's sometimes also called, and then it can move on to do the oxidative phosphorylation and do that electron transport and the chemiosmosis in the mitochondrion. If no oxygen is present, it'll stay out in the cytoplasm, right, so that it can then do anaerobic respiration. So this concludes the first screencast on cellular respiration. We've only scratched the surface here. We've talked about this process of glycolysis, but have not gone into any detail about anaerobic respiration or really aerobic respiration. But at this point, you should know that aerobic respiration is going to involve that citric acid cycle or Krebs cycle and the electron transport system and chemiosmosis. So I said that there were 3 steps that were happening. The first that we talked about was glycolysis, and we did that today. Then if we're talking about aerobic respiration, that second step will be the citric acid cycle. And then finally, that third step will be the electron transport chain and building up a chemical gradient using something called chemiosmosis, which we've already talked about. Okay, that's it for today.